You will not force the
Great friend and colleague needs no introduction, but I only want to mention one thing. His latest book came out this February, we're already in 18, so it's last February, The Atlas of Reality, written with Timothy Pickavans. I've read it. It's an amazing intellectual adventure. I highly recommend it to anybody interested in metaphysics. Methodologically, content-wise, it's just a book. It's a must-have book, and I mentioned in particular about graduate students. So, The Atlas of Reality, koons and Pickavans must buy. Having said that,
can't ask for a better introduction.
it's exciting. It's a really exciting book. I just say it with genuine enthusiasm. And Robbie's going to talk today about model epistemology and the formal identity of intellect and object. Thank you all for being here.
Great, and thank you, Anna, and thank you, Matteo, for organizing this. It's been a great conference. So really enjoyed it, and I'm happy to come back anytime. So thanks. Hylomorphists have mostly focused on the role of form in nature. That's been true of my own work as well. But in Aristotle himself and in the scholastic tradition, forms also play an important role in cognition and in knowledge. And so that's what I want to focus on today. So it's something a bit different from what we've looked at before. Now, both Aristotle and Aquinas and other scholastics subscribe to a formal identity theory about the relationship between the human mind and extramental objects of understanding. This has been one of the more controversial features of the theory, and I want to defend it here, and defend it in a quite robust form, as I think you'll see. And I'm going to talk about epistemology, predominantly epistemology of necessary truths. I don't like talking about a priori, it's not one of my words, so I talk about de necessario, knowledge of necessary truths and how that works. I'm going to suggest that there's a veil of contingency that lies between us and the necessary truths, at least in respect of our sensory knowledge, our empirical knowledge of those necessary truths. Everything that we see, touch, hear, and so on is contingent, and the contingent facts underdetermine the necessary truths in various ways, and so that creates the problem. Now, for Aristotelians, the class of necessary truths and the class of truths that are either essential truths or grounded in essential truths, I think, are the same. It's a coincident category. And also the set of universal truths in the relevant sense. When Aristotle talks about universal, he really means things that are necessary and grounded in some way in essence. So it's, of course, for Aristotelians, it's abstraction by the active intellect, whatever that is, that gives us access to essence and therefore to necessary truths. So when the intellect gains access to a form, Aristotle talks about the form being in the intellect. That is, each concept of an essence is itself a form. Each concept is a form belonging to an individual mind and of the same kind as, conspecific with, the forms that exist out in nature. And I say I'm going to take a very straightforward, realist view of this thesis and defend it. There's a direct causal relation, I would argue, a formal causal relation between these internal forms and the acts of understanding of the intellect and of judgment by the individual human being. Now, Aquinas and the scholastics who follow him call these internal forms the intelligible species. And according to what I'm calling the formal identity thesis, each of these intelligible species is literally conspecific with the forms that you find in substances, both substantial and accidental forms that you find in nature, outside the mind. And there's a couple quotes, I think, on the handout in which Aristotle suggests this, the one from Book 3 of De Anima, well, actually both from Book 3 of De Anima, that the part of the soul which has cognition, as to that part of the soul which has cognition, it must be something unaffected which yet receives the form and is potentially of the same kind as, so conspecific with, the form in nature. And later he talks about the intellect having a capacity to become all things, in some sense, and I want to take that fairly literally. So I'll argue in section 2 that some reification of form is necessary. So I'm happy to think of forms as things in some sense, as necessary to ground our knowledge of necessary truths, and in particular, our knowledge of the necessary truths that involve value, involving objective value. That's what I'm going to focus on for our purposes today. I'm going to, first of all, in section 2, argue this is a problem for physicalism of the causal closure variety. Right? Then in section 3, I'll offer an argument in favor of an Aristotelian as opposed to a Platonic solution to the problem. I'll argue there's two sort of solutions. And then in 4, I'll consider an objection, namely, how is this formal identity thesis compatible with the existence of errors about necessary truths? So there's some danger of proving too much, of eliminating the very possibility of error. So I'll talk about that a little bit, hopefully, if I have time. And then I'll say something at the very end by way of conclusion, perhaps touching on the question of supervenience and why, if I'm right, this gives us some reason to doubt supervenience of the mental and the physical. So section 2, problem for physicalism involving our knowledge of objective value. Let's suppose that we have knowledge of objective value, and more or less going to assume that for the sake of the talk. Why is that a problem for the physicalist? Well, I think already Plato sees this in the little argument that he puts in the mouth of Socrates in the Phaedo, where he says, for by the dog I fancy that these bones and sinews of mine would have been in Megara or Boeotia long ago, carried thither by an opinion of what is best, if I did not think it was better and nobler to endure any penalty in the city. So he's arguing here that his action as an agent is not reducible to the motions of the bones and sinews and so on. And he brings out specifically the fact that he's acting because it seems best to him to stay in Athens. And that seeming best to him, that I would say apprehension of the value of loyalty to Athens is part of the explanation of why those bones and sinews are still in Athens and not in Boeotia or somewhere else. So I'm going to reconstruct Plato's argument using the notion of metaphysical grounding, as it's been produced earlier, and I'm going to end up with an argument that's actually analogous to Kim's overdetermination arguments against mental causation. So it's going to be an overgrounding argument, so to speak, against physicalism. And so that's the argument that starts in section 2 here. So first of all, what do I mean by microphysicalism? I'm going to argue that it's a view in which the microphysical facts are ungrounded or fundamental, and all the facts about human thought and action, and all the facts about the causes of human thought and action are wholly grounded in those microphysical facts. And I think this is a view that really anyone who calls himself a physicalist would embrace. It's a pretty weak definition, a pretty broad definition of microphysicalism. And so the argument is, if I have rational agency, then I'm acting with rational intentions. And those rational intentions result from what reasonably seems best to me to do, as Socrates says. But what reasonably seems best to me to do is going to be either partly caused or partly grounded by the real values of things. So the thought is that practical reason has to be at least partially sensitive to the real objective values of something or other. Otherwise, there'd be no point of having practical reason, or we might say that practical reason has to be sensitive in some way to the normative dimension of things, and that normativity has to involve some sort of objective value in the broad sense. So if I have real agency, then, this is the first sub-conclusion, there are going to be states of mind that are either partly caused or partly grounded by the real value of things. Now, if microphysicalism is true, then these states are wholly grounded in microphysical facts, and all their causes are wholly grounded in microphysical facts. Yeah, that's just a direct consequence of the definition of microphysicalism. Now, premise 4, I'm going to claim that none of the real values of things are even partly weakly grounded by the microphysical facts. So this is a sort of Morean point, that facts about objective value are not grounded in the microphysical facts. Now, here again, I'm not talking about the value of a particular thing, right? Value of a particular car or a particular action. I'm talking about the values of kinds of things. So the value of friendship as such, the value of knowledge as such, the necessary truths that encode these objective values. Those necessary truths about value are not, I would argue, grounded in any way in microphysical facts. There's just no way that could be done. Now, if we could challenge that, we could talk about that in discussion, but that's, I think, a plausible move, and a lot of people might accept that. Now, from that assumption, we get the third sub-conclusion, that if microphysicalism is true, and I have real agency, then there are states involving human agency that are partly grounded both in the real value of things and in the microphysical facts. I won't go through the details, but basically premise 4 rules out the possibility that my judgments of value are caused by the values. They're going to have to be grounded by the values, and also, if microphysicalism is true, wholly grounded in the microphysical level. And then here's where you get a Kim-like move. There's no overgrounding, right? If something is partly grounded in the Y's and wholly grounded in the Z's, then some of the y's are partly grounded in some of the z's, or some of the z's are partly grounded in some of the y's. There has to be some sort of weak partial grounding relationship between the y's and the z's. But we've already ruled all that out in this case, right? I've ruled out at least that the objective facts are wholly grounded, or even partly grounded, in the microphysical facts. And it also seems to me plausible. In fact, given microphysicalism, it's also impossible that the microphysical facts be grounded even partly in the objective values, because they're fundamental. They're not grounded in anything, right? So given the assumptions we've got so far, it's going to be true that if microphysicalism is true, then none of the microphysical facts are partly grounded in the values of things. That's subconclusion 4. And so the conclusion is, if I have real agency, some of what seems best to me to do is not wholly grounded in the microphysical facts. There have to be some facts about me as an agent that are not wholly grounded in the microphysical facts. And so if I have real agency, microphysicalism is false. That's the upshot of the argument. The first 3 premises are predicated on an idea developed and defended recently by my colleague Jonathan Dancy, that all of our intentions, at least our rational intentions, are sensitive to reasons, and reasons are objective facts about value, so to speak, in the world. So microphysicalists have really 3 options, I think. They could deny the reality of human agency. They could bite the bullet there. They could take a Dennett sort of line, some eliminative line. They could deny the real existence of objective value altogether, kind of go complete of subjectivism, or they could claim that objective values are somehow grounded in the microphysical facts. Right? Now, I think all 3 of those are bad options. The first one I think is obviously not promising. On the second one, as Dancy and Korsgaard and others have argued, first of all, they presented some pretty powerful arguments against a kind of Humean subjectivism about practical reason. They're suggesting that you really need some kind of objective value. And in any case, even if you were a Humean, right, you're still going to want to say that it's not rational not to maximize your desires or your preferences. And so that means that you're really saying that there's an objective value to satisfying desires, right? That's the sort of thing that sort of ought to be done in some way. So I think that the idea that there are no objective values at all is actually untenable. At least it's incompatible with a view of real agency. So knowledge of value requires knowledge of necessities. And I think there are 2 compelling reasons why, for Aristotelians, knowledge of the good should be grounded in knowledge of specific natures. Right? So for Aristotelians, there's not going to be such a thing as the form of the good, which we can get a hold of and which will then give us, ground these rational intentions. Is rather being and good, right? Neither of them is a genus. It's rather the case that to be good is for some particular nature to be perfected. And so what we really need are knowledge of particular natures. And from that, we can get Aristotelian natures, including teleology, including final causation. From that, we can get objective value. So let me skip through that. There must, in order for us to have knowledge of essences, of forms, there has to be a connection of some kind. That's basically what my argument is tried to show. A connection between our understanding of essences on the one hand and our knowledge of necessary truths on the other hand. Okay, let me just skip over that. Now, could sensory knowledge alone provide us with this knowledge of essential truths or necessary truths? And I'll argue no, it can't. And here's where I appeal to the veil of contingency, that sensory information provides us only with information about contingent facts. The contingent facts do not provide enough information about the necessary truths of essence. And so we need something that enables us to pierce through that veil of contingency. And that's where the role of substantial form in cognition, I think, is supposed to come into play. David Hume, of course, is probably the first one to point out the fact that there is this sort of veil of contingency, that we can't get to the necessary truths by just piling together lots of data about empirical contingent facts. Now, it's true that sensory imagination gives us some information about what's possible or impossible. But I think that since we're concerned here first about the knowledge of value, it seems that imagination is not going to provide us with access to that sort of information. It's only going to provide us with access about information about about spatial qualities and other sensible qualities. Now, I think that itself is interesting, and I think ultimately even to explain how imagination gives us access to necessary truths about geometry, let's say, you're going to need to appeal to form, accidental form, the form of quantity, ultimately. But for present purposes, it seems that it's certainly not going to help us with the problem of our knowledge of value, I think. And I'm going to skip over that. Okay, so let's look at some arguments for a connection between the realm of necessary truths and the human judgment. Now, some philosophers have argued that we don't need any such connection, but that it's enough for us to have, let's say, justified true beliefs about necessary truths, that's going to be sufficient for knowledge. And of course, Gettier famously argued in '63 that justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge, you need more. And so I'm going to argue that knowledge of necessary truths can also be Gettierized, right? That simply justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge of these necessary truths. There has to be some real connection between the mind and the necessary truths, the essences, just as in the case of perception or memory, there has to be some real connection, causal connection in that case, between our beliefs and the facts that we're perceiving or that we're observing. So I made this argument actually already in 2000 in my book, Realism Regained. So I'll just mention this real briefly here. Suppose that, for instance, you had a drug that produced randomized intellectual seemings or apparent rational intuitions about necessary truths, right? And 1 out of 100 subjects will end up with some true belief about some necessary truth, like the Pythagorean theorem or something like that, and 99 out of the 100 will end up with false seemings. It seems to me that the one who has the true belief does not know the necessary truth, right? Because there's a lack of connection. And even if the true belief were hardwired into the individual, right? Suppose we've got 100 species that are produced more or less randomly, very similar intelligent species. 99 of them come up with false beliefs about necessary truths. 1 of them comes up with some true beliefs about necessary truths just by chance. Again, the members of that species, even though they're hardwired to believe these true things, lack, I think, knowledge because of a lack of connection between the two. So I think we need some sort of real connection. And the question is, what kind of connection could there be that would be sufficient to ground knowledge? Now, you might say, well, what if it were metaphysically impossible for someone to have these, have illusory seemings at all, right? What if it were somehow metaphysically impossible for someone to have false intuitions? Well, I'd have to ask, is this impossibility supposed to be a matter of brute necessity? Then I think it's hard to believe in that, hard to believe that there would be a metaphysically necessary truth that would somehow guarantee that intellectual seemings about necessary truths are true, are veridical. And it looks as though we need some sort of explanation, and the explanation will have to be in the form of some kind of connection, again, tie between the mind and these necessary facts, or the essences in this particular case. So in fact, I think even if it were metaphysically necessary, if it were a brute necessity, it would still be Gettierized. It would still be too accidental to be knowledge conferring. And so some sort of connection is really needed. Now, I think I'm going to, I've got another little argument here, which again, for reasons of time, I probably won't go into. This involves the notion of defeaters of modal judgments. Well, I'll try and run through here real quickly. So if there is no connection, and so there's no sort of deep explanation as to why our beliefs about necessities are true, right? Then there'd be no ironclad explanation of the genesis of reliable intuition about those necessary truths. And if there's no such explanation, there'd be some reason to believe that the objective probability, the prior objective probability of getting it right in this area would be low, right? So if there's a realm of objective value out there, there are necessary truths about that realm, there's no connection between our mind and that realm, right? The kind of more picture. Then it seems that there's at least some grounds for thinking that there's a low probability that we would be reliable about getting that realm correct. But the fact that there's a ground for believing there's such a low probability would constitute what Plantinga and Pollack and others have called a defeater of knowledge here. That's right. So that once I'm aware of that fact, once I'm aware of the fact that there's really low probability that I'm reliable about this stuff, that should undermine any kind of claim of knowledge that I would make. And so knowledge is actually, I think, incompatible with the awareness of this fact. And that would mean that we could be in a situation in which all human judgment of necessity would be irrational. That's impossible. Therefore, there can't exist such defeaters. Therefore, the objective probability must be high. Therefore, there must be some sort of connection between us and the realm of necessary truths. That's the kind of chain of argument there. Okay, now, so let's say you're semi-persuaded, right, that there needs to be some sort of connection between the human mind and these necessary truths, which, again, for Aristotle means some sort of connection between the human mind and essences that are out there in nature, the essences of various species. There's two ways for this to happen, a kind of a broadly Platonic way and an Aristotelian way. Now, this may not really be Plato. When I say called the Platonic way, it's really Aristotle's version of Plato, right? So Plato in scare quotes, let's say, a Platonic way. And on the Platonic way, the universal forms, the forms are universals, and they are something like substances or primary beings in their own right? And so the connection then would have to be one of efficient causation somehow between these forms in the Platonic heaven and the human mind. Right? We see them or we grasp them, and that involves some kind of causal intercourse between us and the universal things. On the Aristotelian picture, the connection is rather one of formal causation. So the forms aren't entities, aren't substances in their own right. They inform human acts of understanding. They don't interact with them. And so from the point of view, again, there are various ways to interpret this, but in a sort of broadly Thomistic and scholastic way of thinking about this, there are actually individual forms of the essences of various kinds, individual forms of humanity, of equinity, and so on, some of which occur naturally and combine with the relevant sort of matter to produce instances of that species, and other particular forms of this kind occur in the mind, in the intellect, informing acts of human understanding, and those then provide us with knowledge about the necessary truths connected with that essence. Right? That's the Aristotelian sort of picture. So on this picture, Aristotle is not a realist in the medieval sense. That is, he doesn't think that there are universals, right? He rather thinks that there are many particular forms, and these forms stand in relations of conspecificity to each other, or congenericity, in the case of more generic forms, to one another. A relation of what Scotus called less than numerical identity, so they're not numerically identical, but there's some sort of intimate relationship between them. You could think of this as a kind of counterfactual or counterpossible identity even. So the two human forms would be the same if their matter were the same, or my form of humanity, my concept of humanity, and Martin's form would be the very same thing if somehow my mental act and his matter were identical. So that the idea is that the distinctness of these forms is not a fundamental or intrinsic distinctness. They derive their distinctness from something else, and that's what unifies them into a single species or a single genus in the broader case. Okay, so the main problem with the Platonic approach is that it makes human understanding a matter that's partly extrinsic to the human mind, right? So it's really not the case that I understand anything. It's really me plus a system of universals interacting in a certain way that has understanding. And that seems implausible. So I think I've got the argument here on the handout as well, this is in section 3 on page 3 of the handout, where I sort of show why I think this is a problem for the Platonists. So knowledge of necessary truth, let's assume, from the first two sections, requires some kind of real connection between essences and the human intellect. So from an Aristotelian point of view, this would have to fall into one of four modes of causation: material, efficient, formal, or final. It obviously can't be material causation, right? Because the essence of a natural thing outside the mind can't be the matter which is my act of understanding, right? Or which underlies my act of understanding, which is inside my mind. It can't be efficient causes because then understanding would be something extrinsic to the human mind, right? So that's the move against the Platonist, basically, which is that it's obvious somehow that our understanding is intrinsic to us. It also, I think, can't really be merely final, because if it were final, then you'd have to suppose that the human intellect already had implicitly all the forms there are as built-in ends towards which it was moving. And so sort of by process of elimination, it looks like the relationship has to be one of formal causation. Right? So there's a form which informs the act of understanding. Okay, that's the move against the Platonist. Now, now there's a problem that the Aristotelian account immediately faces, and the scholastic account as well. And this has been brought out recently by Brouwer and Brouwer-Toland in an article, and also by Panaccio in a book as well. So when a form acts as the formal cause of an intellectual act of understanding, when it constitutes a concept, right, it also constitutes a qualitative accident of the intellect. So my intellect has a qualitative accident that corresponds to the concept that it understands, right? But what if the form that I'm understanding is a non-qualitative form? So it might be a quantitative form, or it might be a substantial form, right? Then the problem is, how could that form, which is the form of a substance, or the form of a quantity, how could that form be a quality in my intellect, right? There's a kind of cross-categorial problem here that they're both pointing out. And you could argue, you could try and say that maybe there's two different forms of formal causation here. You know, the one kind in which the substantial form informs a substance, and another kind of formal causation which stands between the substantial form and the active intellect. I'd rather not go that way because it complicates the story quite a bit, rather just stick with one kind of formal causation. So I think that my preferred solution here would be to suppose that it's the very same kind of form. It really is, let's say, a substantial form of humanity, right? It informs an active intellect, and by informing that active intellect, it constitutes a qualitative accident of the intellect. Why? Because of the nature of the thing it's informing, right? That is, when the substantial form informs some appropriate matter, the result is a substance. When the substantial form informs an act of understanding, the result is a qualitative accident of the intellect. So it's the nature of the receiver of the form that makes a difference here, as not the difference in the form itself, and not a difference in the formal causation, right? It's really rather the object, the thing that is being modified, that makes a difference. And this is very traditional scholastic kind of a picture. Okay, so how, you might say, but wait, how can the act of understanding, which by hypothesis is an accidental form in my mind, how could that be conspecific with a substance, right? How could this act of understanding my mind be conspecific with Martin, right? How is that possible? Well, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. That is, the two forms are functionally interchangeable in terms of their intrinsic character. The form, which is in my mind, is the concept of humanity, has everything intrinsically that would be required to be the form of an actual human being were it combined with matter in the appropriate way, and vice versa. At Martin's form, which combines with matter to produce Martin, has every capacity to become a mere concept, well, to be a concept. Now, there are various reasons why forms can't actually make that transition from being a substantial form to being a concept, and vice versa. But that doesn't really matter, I think. For the Aristotelian here, all we need to do is to look at the intrinsic potentiality, so to speak, of these forms. Does it have intrinsically what it would take to be a substantial form of a human being? If so, then that's enough. Okay, so I've got figure 1, which I think is on the 4th page, which I kind of give you a picture of how this works. So we've got two substantial forms here of equinety, one of which is modifying various parts of an equine body, and the result is a horse on the right-hand side, right? There's a conspecific form of equinety which modifies an act of understanding that is itself the act of the soul of a human being, and that results in a concept or an understanding of equinety. And I've got in between here this veil of contingency, which shows that sensory information from the horse is never going to get past the veil of contingency. So I'm never going to get any knowledge of the necessary, the essential features of a horse through sense perception. But conspecificity here pierces the veil of contingency, right? The horse produces in me, it duplicates in me a form of equinety, right, which is of the very same species as the form outside, and therefore provides me with all the information there is about the necessary truths of that essence, right? So what happens is that the act of understanding is now empowered by this form to form judgments about necessary truths which are reliably correct, that are reliably connected to the essence of equinety itself, the essence of the horse. So that's the idea. I think there's a kind of analogy here between this and Aristotle's account of color perception. And even before we talk about perception, we could talk about Aristotle's account of how color modifies the medium. So Aristotle's view is that the blue is an accident of the chair, but it's also somehow carried by the transparent medium between me and the chair, not in the way of making the medium blue, right? Rather, I would say, this is my interpretation, what's really going on here is it's a second-order quality of the medium. That is, the first-order quality of the medium is transparency, and the transparency is what's modified by the color, right, in such a way as to convey blue to me. That's the picture. In a similar sort of way, the reason I don't become a horse when I have a concept of a horse, right, is that it's a second-order form here. It's a form that's modifying an active understanding. It's not directly modifying my matter in such a way as to create an actual horse. So that's the picture. Now, there's been several deflationary accounts of the identity thesis. So everyone who looks at Aristotle or Aquinas sees that you have this kind of thesis, that somehow or other the form in the mind is identical to the form outside. And I think most of us all think that it can't be numerical identity or else you fall into Platonism. It can't be literally, numerically the same form in my mind and out there in nature. But the view that I'm defending, obviously, is a fairly extreme view here, right? Which is that the form in the mind is literally of the same species as the forms you find out in nature. And there have been a number of attempts to get by without that kind of strong claim and to try to capture what's important in Aristotle or Aquinas without doing that. So one, by Panaccio, again that I mentioned, Claude Panaccio, would be to say, look, formal identity is just similarity. So there's just some similarity between the concept of a horse and a horse, right? It doesn't have to be literal conspecificity. The problem with that is that, of course, first of all, Aristotle's account of similarity is going to be in terms of having the form of the same kind, right? So, and again, I'm not just talking about substantial forms here. My account also applies to accidental forms. So the form of a square in my mind has got to be informed by squareness, right? By the very same geometrical property that you find out there in the world. And so the similarity there is going to have to be grounded in the same form. And in addition, mere similarity in some very broad or vague sense is not going to be sufficient to solve my problem, right? Because I'm trying to establish a real connection between the mind and the essence in such a way that knowledge of necessary truths is grounded. And if you just have something that's similar in some way or other to the horse or to the square, that's not going to be sufficient to explain the knowledge. A second sort of view would be to say that formal identity consists in mere causal contact. Robert Pasnow suggested this. John O'Callaghan, although I think O'Callaghan's view is much closer to mine, Pasnow said, look, given an Aristotelian account of efficient causation, any time you have an effect, the form of the cause is sort of virtually present in the effect. And so the mere fact that our concepts have been caused by horses and colors and squares is enough to make them formally identical with their objects, right? And it seems to me that's again, obviously not sufficient, right? Because at least from the point of view of knowledge, the mere fact that something's been caused by a horse is not going to give it the capacity to ground knowledge about all the necessary truths involving horses, about the horse's essence, right? That's not nearly sufficient. Unless, as O'Callaghan does, you point out that this is a very special case of causation, right? This is a case where the form succeeds in duplicating itself in the intellect, right? Producing something of the very same species. And that is exactly what I'm claiming, right? That there's something analogous here between the way in which the parent generates the child horse, the way in which the builder, the form of the mind of the builder produces the building, and the way in which the horses that I'm investigating inform my mind with the form of horse. That there's something analogous in each of these cases. Something literally conspecific or congeneric is involved. Okay, a third possibility, and this is Brouwer and Brouwer-Toland, is to suggest that formal identity is just a primitive kind of intentionality. So in their view, the concept of horse in my mind counts as being formally identical to a quantity out there in the world just because it stands for it. Right? It stands in some sort of primitive intentionality relationship to horses, to horsey forms, and that's sufficient. Well, that might be sufficient if your concern were merely a concern about how intentionality is possible, right? You could just say it's primitive and move on, right? But it seems to me it doesn't solve the knowledge problem that I'm having. That doesn't explain how it is that this concept of equinity grounds knowledge of the necessary truths about the essence of a horse, or the essence of a square, or the essence of red, or whatever it is we're investigating. And so once we take that into account, so this is why I think what I'm doing is actually similar in some ways to an argument that Ross has made, in which he's argued that you need something like this traditional account of formal identity to make sense of intentionality at all. Well, to make sense of a certain kind of determinate intentionality that human beings are capable of. And I think there's a lot of value to Ross's argument. I'm not really disagreeing with it, but I think that what I'm discussing here would provide more support for the same kind of thesis by focusing not just on determinate intentionality, but also on knowledge, on our knowledge of necessary truths. And suppose we tried to amplify the Brouwer-Toland account by saying that this primitive intentionality relation between my concept of horse and all the individual horses, is actually a formal causal relation. Well, then the problem would be that you would have, it would be a variant on the Platonic problem, only worse, right? Now, instead of just me plus the universals interacting in order to produce thought, it would have to be me and all the horses that are out there, right? That collectively thinking something, right? Because their forms would be somehow formally causing directly the concept in my mind, and that would just seem bizarre to me. So it seemed to me much better to say, no, there's a new form in my intellect, right, which is conspecific with those forms out there in nature. It's not that those forms directly somehow impinge on my mind in such a way as to give me understanding. Okay, so some implications of this. Let me just mention this briefly. This is relevant, perhaps, to the debate that William and I and others have had about the nature of the forms. I mean, to make sense of this, you really do have to treat forms as things of a kind, not just as formings or structurings or whatever. There have to be entities, I think, to make sense of this. They have to be particular. They have to be ontologically prior to the substances of which they are forms, right? So that you can have two things, one in the intellect and one out there in nature, right, that are conspecific. And the one out in nature is ontologically prior to the instance of the species. That's why knowing a lot about the form or the essence gives you information about what the necessary truths of things of that species, right? So they have to be ontologically prior. They also have to, I think, be simple in some sense. And this sort of gets to Howard's earlier point. I actually think Aristotle succeeds in giving an account of the absolute unity of form in the relevant part of metaphysics. And I think part of that is because, well, I agree with Howard on this, that if he failed at that, then the whole project falls apart, I think, because it would be really difficult to understand how a complex thing could be the ground of my knowledge about the necessary truths, because it would just force the question as to how do I know that these various things need to be put together in order to have the concept of a horse? And so it would just push the problem back a step. Okay, so on the handout, and I don't really have time to go into this in detail, but this is a sketch of how I think Aristotle might solve this problem, and a sort of a sketch of how the Porphyrian tree should look in Aristotle's picture. So the thought is that at the bottom you have species, and you have multiple forms within each species, which bear a relation of conspecificity to each other. And this conspecificity could be explained in terms of the groundedness of their distinctness, right? So they're distinct from each other, and there's a particular kind of explanation as to how they're distinct, which has to do with the distinctness either of the matter that they inform or of the intellects that they inform, or both, right? That's required for that. Now, at a higher level, you also have relations of congenericity, right? So the human form and various equine forms stand in a relation of congenericity, maybe level 1, to each other, right? Which together forms the genus of animal, right? And how does that work? Well, here I would appeal to a specific sort of cascade of causal powers that are exercised by the efficient cause of the human being or of the animal. So my thought is that the parents that generate the human being exercise a series of differential powers, right? First of all, to produce a substance, then a body, then an animal, then a rational animal, right? And these differential powers have to be exercised not necessarily temporally successively, but causally successfully. That is, you can't exercise the power of forming an animal unless, in a way that depends upon having exercised or exercising the power of forming a body, and so on. So they're serially related in a way that corresponds to the steps in the Porphyrian tree, and that's what then explains. So the human form is not composite. It doesn't contain something animal and something rational that are somehow glued together. Right? All the forms are simple. What makes the human form an animal form is something to do with its etiology, something to do with how the particular form is generated, what sort of powers are exercised by the parents in this particular case. Okay? So I think that, anyway, as I say, I don't really have time to go into the details of that, but maybe during discussion we could address that a bit. Now let me say something real briefly here about how error is possible. Because you might say, look, if you use this simple sort of diagram, it looks as though it's all or nothing, right? I mean, either you understand horses, in which case you've got access to all the information there is about the essential structure of horses, or you have nothing. Right? And obviously the world is messier than that, it's more complicated than that. And so I've talked a little bit here in this section about various sources. There are three sort of sources that are pretty easy to get. You might think there's a slippage between intellectual judgment and linguistic expression. So I might really understand what a horse is, but I might get the terminology wrong and call it a dog or something, right? There might be errors based on omission about individual cases. So in the case of value, right, I might really know all there is to know about eudaimonia, about happiness for human beings, but misapply the concept to particular cases because I had not fully informed about the human being's life, right? So that kind of error is possible. I think there are certain sort of calculational errors that are possible. So again, it might be a kind of calculation involved in terms of combining the various value-providing features of a situation into a single, all things considered judgment about value. And there's some calculational problems. But it still seems to me all of those are not really adequate, because we want to have an account of what it is to have a sort of partial grasp of a nature, right? Or a confused, real but somewhat confused grasp of humanity, equanimity, or squareness, or so on. And Aquinas does talk this way in question 85 of the first part. He discusses this a bit. He says we can understand a form imperfectly. But of course the question is, the $65,000 question is, what does that mean exactly, right? Given the kind of simple account I have where, you get a form in the intellect, it forms an active understanding, again, it seems like it's all or nothing. It seems like it's black or white. So there seems to be that there's sort of two options here. We could say that, well, perhaps in some cases you get mutilated forms that aren't quite, they're close to, but not exactly what you would find in a real horse. Or that perhaps you get instances of incomplete or mutilated formal causation. So the formal causation doesn't go through as fully as it would. I think that's a possible account, but a lot more would have to be said to sort of explain how that works. In any case, you'd want to make that very much the exception rather than the rule, or else you would undermine the idea that this is a basis for knowledge. Right? So that's one possible way to go. Another thing that Aquinas suggests, is a fifth possible source, is that we sometimes substitute proper accidents for the real differentia of a substance. In fact, we maybe always do this, and I think this is right. So we may, in fact, never really understand the essence of a human being or of a horse, right? But we might be able to get together some accidents that are not too far removed from the essence, so to speak, and which together enable us to successfully classify human beings. And that might still give us some information, some real information about the necessary truths that are associated with being human or being horse. And that, in turn, might give us at least some grasp on questions of value, of what happiness is. So even if I don't know exactly what the human essence is, I may know enough about its rational animality to be able to recognize the value of knowledge and friendship and this sort of thing. I think that's plausible. And again, I want to emphasize that the account that I'm giving here is not limited just to substantial form or essences of substances, but also applies to our knowledge of quantity, our knowledge of geometry, our knowledge of other sorts of accidents as well. And then finally, Aquinas suggests, also in question 85, article 3, that we might, in some cases, confuse a genus and a species underneath the genus. And so that's a possible error. And so what this would involve, I think we could generalize this a bit. This would be a case of truly understanding an essence, but locating the essence incorrectly in a Porphyrian tree. So not sort of seeing its causal relations, that is, its relations of genus and differentia correctly. So we could have an incomplete picture of the Porphyrian tree. And I think that's perfectly compatible with the story that I've given here as well. Okay, finally, in terms of a conclusion, if I got a couple minutes left yet, let me say something about supervenience, actually. Because it seems to me that on this picture, we'd have at least some grounds for thinking that supervenience might fail, even supervenience of the intellectual on the broadly physical. And it has to do with the fact that, that there's an argument here I think you could give, and again, it's a very traditional argument, for the non-physicality of these acts of understanding. So let's focus on our knowledge of quantitative accidents. Right? It seems to me that we could have concepts of various quantitative accidents. In particular, I might have a concept of a quantitative accident that's never actually instantiated. Right? Or maybe it can't be some fifth dimensional shape or something like that, right? And I might really understand that, and so I would have that sort of form in the mind. Now, can acts of understanding themselves have quantitative properties? Can they instantiate quantitative accidents? It seems to me that in some sense they can, right? If I consider adopting a certain posture or a certain gesture, or as William likes to talk about, throwing a ball, there are geometrical properties, quantitative properties to that activity, to that act itself. Right? So in particular, you might think that neural activity has various geometrical properties, and David was sort of alluding to this earlier, geometrical and temporal properties of various kinds. So if the problem is that, again, going back to my diagram, to understand this, let's say, five-dimensional shape, you would actually have to have something of that kind in the mind. It would have to modify some act of understanding. But if the act of understanding itself has some physical quantitative features, right, it won't be able to instantiate this five-dimensional shape, right? So it looks as though the act of understanding has got to be something which in itself devoid of such quantitative determinations, so that it could then be modified by any sort of determination whatsoever. Just as the medium has to be transparent, right, for the color to modify the transparency. If it had a color already, that would be somehow incompatible with it being modified by color in the appropriate sort of way. So that suggests that acts of understanding don't involve the actualizing of the potentialities of any body. That is, as Aquinas says, that there's no organ of insight, no organ of thought. And then this finally suggests that we could have a failure of supervenience. I don't have an airtight argument for this, but it seems plausible to think that you might have two human beings, right, who are physical duplicates of each other, one of whom really understands some essence in my diagram sort of way. There's an act of understanding that's really informed by the form of equinity. The other one doesn't. There's no such form instantiating that particular act of understanding. And everything else is exactly the same. Right? In this case, it might be that the one who doesn't instantiate the form might even have true beliefs about horses, right? So have exactly the same beliefs, and they might all be true, but the difference is that the second wouldn't know the horse in the way the first does, right? And that seems to be possible, and if it is possible, then that would be a violation of supervenience, because you'd have a difference at the intellectual level that wasn't reflected at the physical level. Good, so I'll stop there and give us a chance to discussion. Okay, thanks.
So if I've understood correctly, you envisage
Conspecificity. Yeah, that's kind of mouthful.
between the actual form of real horses and the form of the horse that we form in our mind. And the form of the horse we form in our mind is one that's formed through repeated experience of external forces. So I just want to express a sort of a question, express a sort of concern about that, right? That the sort of knowledge that we would have of horses from looking at them is largely from the visible morphological features of horses, right? And the internal organs and how they work would not generally be parts of that. Okay?
Right.
So That seems a concern to me, that in fact the real form of the horse would include the internal structure of working
Absolutely.
a proper horse. And one can imagine that one could have two morphologically seemingly identical species, bats and hares or whatever, the examples you think sometimes given, which don't appear different to, but are considered by biologists because of the details to be distinct.
Yeah.
So I just wondering about how you address that worry, Rob.
Yeah. Good. So I said absolutely nothing about how this happens, right? That is, I'm describing the success conditions. What would it be to really understand the essence of a horse? Well, it would have to be, you'd have this form in your head. How do you get there? Is it just by observing lots of horses? No. The answer is the perfect science of horses. That's the thing that will get you from zero to success. So you know, that would include everything that you would do ecologically, biochemically, genetically, and so on. And we're not there yet, right? So in fact, none of us understands horses yet. We've all got some constellation of accidents which is doing duty now for us. We might hope eventually in a perfect science we'll converge on a place where we really do grasp the essence. So I do think there's a temptation here, and of course my presentation really invites this confusion of saying, hey, it's pretty simple, just go out there and see some horses, and then it forms the form of a horse in your mind, and there you go. But of course it's not like that at all. It's a fantastically complicated process involving the maturity of science to achieve that.
Thanks very much for your talk, really interesting. So I had a couple of minor quibbles about both the arguments. Maybe if there's time, I'll just come to the really brief. But I had a comment first about representation in the brain. So there's evidence that the brain represents some things topographically, so that the relational structures out there in the world map onto similar spatial relational structures in the brain. But there's no requirement that be the case. I mean, on theories of representation like Cummins and Nick Shay's, the only requirement is that the relational structure, the relations out there in the world map onto some relations in the brain. Not that they map onto, not that spatial structure maps onto spatial structure. So you can use a three-dimensional representing medium to represent a 50-dimensional space.
Touch is another point, I guess, against your argument that understanding can't be causal.
So the point was that we don't always find the same, let's say, quantitative pattern in the brain that we're understanding. But though maybe we sometimes do.
You do. It's just that the pattern, the way in which the brain maps the represented onto the representation need to be a one-to-one mapping between the dimensionalities of the represented and the I'm explaining for about you.
Right.
I want to represent a five-dimensional object in my intellect. I need to have a five-dimensional space in which to do it. I just need 5 degrees of freedom.
Well, right. But my point of that argument was, if you accept my picture, right, that to understand is to have literally something conspecific instantiated in the mind somewhere, then to understand that five-dimensional shape, you would have to have something that instantiates that five-dimensional shape. And my argument is there's nothing in the brain that could do that, right?
I mean, that's the point. It's just that the dimensions don't map onto spatial dimensions. They map onto degrees of freedom and the oscillations of neurons and things like that. I mean, the brain does represent certain things topographically, like the body. We have a literal spatial map of the body represented in the brain. It doesn't seem to represent everything like that. So you might have different mapping relations where dimensionality, high spatial dimensionality maps onto certain neural degrees of freedom, rather than mapping onto space dimensions.
Yeah, so I'm not, I'm not sort of challenging that we might be able to do that, because I'm not saying anything about intentionality, right? It may well be that, the brain, by doing certain things, is representing the world in a certain way. My question is, but where do you get knowledge of necessary truths out of that? And there, it's not enough just to find some one-to-one mapping between the two. You have to have the very thing that about whose essence we're considering there for inspection, so to speak. And so that's why I think anything like that, one-to-one mapping, representational kind of story, is not going to meet what I'm trying to get to anyway. Yeah, please, yeah. Because I interrupted his question sadly.
So I have a bunch of points. I'll be quick, I don't want to take up too much time. So about the argument in section 2.
Yeah.
I have some problems with that. First, it wasn't clear why microphysicalists would accept premise 4. So it seems like, if I'm a microphysicalist, I'm not going to think there are any objective facts that don't seem to be that are grounded in microphysical facts.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they might. So then we'd have to have a big argument about that. I mean, but your options at this point are pretty limited. I mean, how exactly are these facts about the value of friendship, let's say, going to be grounded in the microphysical facts? I mean, I guess you could talk about adaptations for survival or something like that, I think.
I agree it's not plausible, but the worry is just that you've already established that microphysicalism doesn't hold. I mean, we'd be supposing that it doesn't hold as part of an argument that it doesn't hold for agency.
Yes. So I'm assuming that the microphysicalist is committed to saying that there are no facts about human agency that are not grounded. But I'm leaving it open that they might think there are all kinds of other facts that aren't grounded in. So that's why I said it was a kind of weak definition of microphysicalism.
Yeah, sure. There's one, if I can, very briefly. Sorry, I just had another
Yeah, go ahead.
It was about the overgrounding premise.
Yeah.
And this is really quickly, I think.
Okay.
I do think something like that's probably true for, say, composition or constitution, but it's not true for grounding in general. So, I mean, if I take the disjunctive proposition, either I'm making this point or you're standing at the podium, that on most understandings of grounding is grounded both in the fact that you're standing at the podium and the fact that I'm making this point, or the proposition, the truth of I'm presupposing that truth-making is a form of grounding, so that the proposition that there's more than one person in the room is grounded in every disjoint couple of people rather than greater than one. But they're not grounded. So it's just
yeah, no, you're right. I mean, and I'd have to say a lot more about that sort of case in particular. And my view would be that in the case in which both disjuncts are true, the ground is actually both facts, the sum of the two facts, right? Not each fact separately. But yeah, then I have to defend why do I want to say that, and I just sort of begging the question against overgrounding. So I think that's a fair point.
I think we have a microphone, so Christopher is next.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Rob, for that really rich and interesting talk. Can I ask a question on the difference between, there's the same form, but the differences there, is it a difference in medium? Is that what I understood you say? So there's
something like that, that's right. So difference in what is receiving the form, what the form is modifying.
Right, okay. So yeah, my first sort of thought would have been along the lines of John. I would have thought, well, come on, sure that we don't have that sort of thing. You would rather saying, okay, it's not complete, and to really be complete, it's got to include biochemical things and all sorts of things that are controlling inner morphology and an optical fact. Okay, good, because that's what's happening in the real world, surely, or in the non-mental world. But then I guess my worry is that those things being exactly the same and differing only in medium looks very strange. It looks like the sort of thing like I can know facts about how, genes work, how cells work, how horses form hair, and how their faces are shaped. I can know all those facts sort of propositionally, but they don't have any dynamic role in the way they do in the world. So are we conceiving of forms like a list of functional specificities, right? And then in the world, those functions work. That is, they work on the matter. In my mind, they work, quote unquote, in my intellect to sort of, evocatively picture horses or...
Yeah, no, there's a good question, and there's a lot of details to work out here. But the thought was that there are dynamic aspects, in a sense, on both sides. So the understanding of the essence of a horse that I have is then responsible for my forming various judgments and making various inferences about horses. Right? And the thought is that just as the form of the horse in matter is responsible for its having a circulatory system, let's say, right? So too, the form of the horse in my mind is responsible for my judging that horses have circulatory systems, right? And so the thought, I'm going to try and press the parallelism for all the way down the road, right? So the fact that horses are very sensitive to sound, right, would be correspond to forming a judgment that if there's a horse who's hearing some sound, it will respond skittishly or whatever. So a kind of notion that my inferential patterns, given understanding the horse, will mirror the causal patterns in the world. And that seems to be right. You know, I mean, that's if you really understand horses, you should be able to do that sort of thing, right?
That seems right, but it seems to kind of disconnect with this not inferential patterns going on. Is that just medium dependent? Like if you took the form of a horse and, as it were, put it in the mind, and now all of a sudden instead of informing matter to be scared of sounds, it's literally just informing an intellect to make judgments about sound.
That's the idea.
Yeah. All right.
That's the claim anyway.
He's on the same line.
Well, kind of a follow-up on Christopher's question, because I'm a bit puzzled by the notion of form here. So both Plato and Aristotle press the notion of form into service to do various theoretical jobs, both metaphysical and epistemological. For
Right.
Plato, it seems that it's the epistemological knowledge of driving, because he thinks we can't have knowledge of changeable things, so he needs to posit this domain of objects that aren't subject to changeable forms.
Yeah.
And the worries about Plato that you get in like the later dialogues have to do with, well, how, if forms are understood this way, do we get them to do the metaphysical roles that we're supposed to have them do it? For Aristotle, it seems like it's going to be the metaphysical roles that do the driving. And you might look at the disagreements here among various Aristotelian people about how it works in the knowledge. It might be the case that he has a difficulty accommodating the small particle things, but at the very least, he thinks that the best examples of substance are things like this man and this horse, and these concrete biological things. And he introduced the notion of form to explain how they can change, how they can persist through changes, their unity, their behavioral regularities. And, you know, when I sort of look at this, forms must be integral wholes, they have proper parts. This starts to make them look like composite substances themselves, as opposed to, you know, composites, there's substances, which are, the composites are the most real thing, kind of forms introduce a way of trying to explain certain aspects of them. This looks to make forms out to be substances themselves. You know, I just start to wonder, it's not to say that, well, obviously it's not Aristotelian, so it's got to be wrong. I'm just sort of wondering, like, why even use the Aristotelian vocabulary? Why not just say, well, yeah, look, this is a different view, and I just think it might say something.
So yeah, I guess I disagree with your take on the history, really. I mean, I think that both Plato and Aristotle throughout are interested in both metaphysics and epistemology, and that survives. And you know, that's why I talk about the De Anima so much. It seems to me it's very clear in De Anima. And so part of my quibble with a lot of contemporary hylomorphism is that it completely ignores this epistemological side and just focuses on the role that form plays in nature, so to speak, which is fine, but you know, why not think about the epistemology as well? It just provides more motivation or more justification for going with a more hylomorphic picture. Now, the other question you asked, I mean, does it make form into substance? Well, so, forms are, on my view, entities. They're not substances, of course, because to be a substance is to be a bearer of active and passive causal powers, efficient causal powers, and the forms don't have that at all. So that, in that respect, they're not qualified as substances. But you and I take very different views, as many people do, about what's going on in the syllabus arguments, things like that in Zeta. I take from it the lesson that a form is not a part of a substance in the same way that the elements are parts. But it might be a part of a substance in a different way. Big evidence for that is that Aristotle keeps talking about substances as synalon, a composite, right? A putting together of form and matter in some sense. So I think there's some sense in which they are parts. And the way I think they're parts is that the form is something which is responsible for the substances having the properties it does, the basic properties it has.
It's not responsible in any sort of causal or...
Not an efficient causal, it has its own unique sort of formal causal relation.
I thought you just said a second ago that they couldn't be substances because they didn't have causal power.
efficient causal powers. Right. So, I think that's really important. So I talk about forms having formal causal powers, and those are quite different from efficient causal powers.
Can I follow up on the same
Yeah,
point?
yeah.
If I was generally discussing, I wanted to ask about the reification of the forms and
Yeah.
what is actually meant by that, and what also drives, if that was driven by the logic of the argument that gave in this paper, where you had independent reasons for wanting to verify the form. The forms.
Yeah.
Parenthetically, I wanted to also refine the point that, in fact, Aristotle talks about substances as synonym does not necessarily imply that distinction of matter and form as what is put together, because it could be that there are parts of the substance that are synologified, if we can invent this term. So, yes, there is a sense of composition there, but need not be.
I see. Right. Yeah. Okay. Does he not talk about simple bodies as being a case of a synolon as well?
But any single body could, we can
still have
always-
parts.
Yeah,
There's potential parts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I see. Okay, right. Okay, that's fair enough. Yeah, so this is a really good question, actually, and it's something I'm still working on. So my thought was that yes, that this argument provides some reason for thinking that we should reify form. But yeah, let me think. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm not positive. Suppose we tried to take that back. So suppose we said, well, look, what's conspecific is, I don't know, the act of understanding in the horse, so to speak, right? Cut the forms out. Yeah. Maybe that is good enough.
Present argument, I think you would have what you want. That's why I was asking whether you have independent reasons.
Yeah. Maybe that's right. I mean, this is something I'm, still confused about, to be honest. So, yeah, I think it's good to press me on it.
My offering towards that I think arises from what you said. So you drew a comparison between the skeletal, the father, and I guess, the science of equinity and the formula mind. So you were doing this comparison and said, if you take them sort of seriously, then you may be thinking that what happens is that there is a literal transmission of the form from the mind of the sculpture onto this marble that will become a statue. And if it is transmission, then that kind of speaks in ways that suggest that there is literally something, a thing that is transferred from the mind.
Numerically identical thing that transferred. Yeah, so I don't think that.
Right, okay, that's the only thing in your own paper that made me think that you had an argument inside the paper, within the paper, for refining the form. So I think you can get everything you want without.
Yeah, right. Maybe that's right. Yeah, I need to think about that. I think that's probably right. And even the thing I do about the Porphyrian tree, I think that could still do the same thing. So I could just say, look, it's the substances that are congeneric. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good. Fair enough. I think point taken. Yeah.
Thanks, John. And next, I have David, but if you mind if I allow Matteo first, and then we'll come up to you. So Matteo.
Thanks, Robert. That was very interesting. I have a question about a fringe case that puzzles me, which is the case in which the object of the intellect is the intellect itself. So you would have, as you can imagine, really interested in the case of consciousness. And so in this case, I was thinking you would have, for the identity physics, you would have the form of the object, right? The form of the force is the same as the form in plane, in my understanding, so in the intellect. But in a case in which the intellect is thinking about itself and trying to understand itself, I was wondering, first of all, are there two forms in play here, or there's just one form? And what is the knowledge that we can have about the sort of like necessary truths about phenomenal properties of consciousness? Of course, we are not going to deduce a priori all the properties of the brain, only thinking about our consciousness, because it doesn't work in the case of external objects. I don't see why it should work in the case of the intellect. But are there any necessary truths that we can deduce, since we are the form that is sort of investigating itself?
Good. Okay, yeah, there's a lot there. Yes, so I thought about the sort of problem that you were alluding to at the beginning, right? Which is, I mean, suppose I'm thinking about the human essence, right? Well, I mean, I don't want to. I'm already a human being, right? So I've already got the human essence there, right? But this is why in the diagram I introduced the act of understanding as the intermediary, right? So there's an act of understanding which itself modifies my form, and that is modified by another form of humanity in this case. So in that case, if I ever do, achieve full understanding of the human essence, there will, so to speak here, be two human essences, one informing my matter, and a second informing a particular act of understanding. And that would require, a lot of anthropological investigation. I'm not going to be able to just sit in Descartes' little room and reflect on myself and gain that knowledge of the human essence, I think, on my picture. Now, you might sort of press me even further and say, okay, what about the essence of an act of understanding, right? Now you got a problem, right? Because you'd have to have an act of understanding being modified by a further form of the act of understanding. I'm not sure that's a problem, actually. Again, you might just have those two forms, both present, one modifying the other. And secondly, and this is something I didn't mention in the paper, which I should probably mention, is that, again, this is an account of how we understand the simple, or I might say basic, natures that are there in the world. And so there are lots of complex notions that we can form. I can form the notion of a kangaroo in a zoo, right? Or a kangaroo in a car, or whatever, right? And I'm not going to I won't have to have a kangaroo in a car form in my intellect in order to do that, right? It's enough to have the kangaroo form and the, whatever, form of inness and various other things. So those sorts of nominal essences, you might say, notional, definable concepts, you could explain just by combining various things in various ways. And so that might be relevant, too, if I'm trying to think about we're worrying about, well, is there such a thing as the form of the human? Is it an entity or not, right? I think that I can form a kind of notion of that by thinking of, something that's the form of a human being. And so the human being part will have to correspond to some essence, right? But, and maybe the form part will, too, but there won't have to be a single form that corresponds to the whole complex notion. So that's the first question you asked. The second one is, I didn't want to say much about sensation, sense perception here, but I want to say something similar about that. So I want to be a fairly naive realist about secondary qualities. They're really out there in the world, colors and smells and so on. And when I successfully perceive these things, they're instantiated by acts of sensory perception in my mind. And so there's something literally red in me, or literally blue when I'm seeing the blue chair. Now, of course, it's not a physical thing. This is another argument for the immateriality of some of these aspects. It's some immaterial act of the soul which instantiates the very blueness that's out there in the world. And that then explains how I'm able to know various necessary truths about color, for instance, right? That blue is more similar to purple than it is to orange, let's say. A necessary truth. How do I know that? Because I've got literally forms of blue, orange, green, right, in the mind, right, which then supports judgments about relative distance between those different shades. Likewise with the primary qualities, right? One could explain how I know geometry based on the fact that there are literal shapes of things in the mind, exactly the same shape, not just a one-to-one mapping, not just a representation, but the very shape itself. Because otherwise, how could you know, right, that between the 2 points there's a third point and so on? You have to have those quantitative accidents in the mind itself, so to speak, grounding those judgments. That's the thought. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I was really puzzled by the analogy between the knowledge of something external and the knowledge of my own intellect. And I was thinking about the case in which some people say, for example, is it possible that you discover that you are yourself a zombie, you have no qualia, you have no phenomenon experience at all. So I was thinking, in this case, it seems to me that as I might think that I know dolphins, because there is this correspondence between their form that informs dolphin form in my mind. But then I discovered that I thought dolphins were fish, where they are mammals. So it turns out I didn't know dolphins at all, the form wasn't there at all. But does it mean that the same can happen with the form of consciousness itself, something like phenomenal properties? Namely, can I discover that I was really wrong about necessary truth about consciousness and I'm not conscious at all? So it seems impossible to many people. So.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. So, I mean, understanding the essences of substances, right, that's pretty difficult, I think, right? Precisely because, we don't perceive them, right, and not necessarily not directly. Whereas the knowledge of the essence of colors and shapes, not so problematic because we're equipped with these sensory capacities. And so then what about our knowledge about our own mind? Well, yeah, I mean, I think we do have, and I didn't really talk about this, but it seems we do have some sort of capacity for introspection or reflection here. And, but of course, in a broadly Thomistic way of thinking about things, that knowledge is parasitic on our knowledge of natural things, right? If I didn't already have knowledge of natural things, I wouldn't be able to reflect on that process and see, oh, I actually know something about color. But I don't have a story for exactly how that works. Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping it would be similar in a way to the story about sense perception, but yeah, I don't know.
Can I do a quick follow-up on what you were saying about your position as a literalist in perception? But you're not thinking like Sorachi that the eye jelly will become really red when you look at something red. You were saying the act of perception is going to instantiate the form of redness.
Well, I do think, I mean, when I gave that example, of course, I wasn't endorsing the physics there of the color being in the medium. I was just saying that's how Aristotle thought about it. But of course, I think it's pretty clear that I disagree with Sorachi in thinking that Aristotle thought that either the medium or the eye jelly become literally red. I think rather that there's some kind of second-order redness that they have. That is, the transparency has a kind of quality of redness. But it really is redness. So in that sense, I'm maybe not that far from Sorachi. There is an instance of redness of a kind. It's just a very different sort from the way in which redness is instantiated by matter, by surfaces, let's say.
It's really interesting. As you described a bit more, I think of you more as a spiritualist, where there is something fundamentally different in the nature of the substratum instantiation of that form.
Yes, right. I'm trying to get an account of a kind of spiritual presence in Thomas's sense of the color.
I'm not sure. Maybe just neither of the two, but if one of the two, more spiritualist one.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I have David and Warren. And Warren, you have to go first because David doesn't know.
Sure. If I've understood you correctly, you're saying you can know necessary truths based on your partial knowledge of the essence of the horse. And if that's the case, why do you need the essence of the horse at all? And if the essence of the horse is potentially not knowable, doesn't it become some kind of platonic idea?
Yeah. So I think it is knowable, right? I'm not denying that. I just think it's really, really difficult to know, and we haven't got there yet, and who knows how long it might take if we ever do get there. But I think it is humanly knowable, you would once you got down to that level, you would now understand why horses do have all the accidents they do, right? So you'd have access to all the necessary truths about horses, basically, once you got to that level. Whereas if I'm just limited to a set of proper accidents, I'm going to get some of the necessary truths, but not all of them. Roughly, that's the answer I'd give.
Yeah, I just wanted to put some pressure on the argument of three.
Yeah.
In particular, I wasn't clear what the problem, what's so bad about there being an efficient causal relation between, you say that a human understanding would be purely passive in, sorry, what you said?
Yeah.
Merely passive in the act of understanding, if it were a case of efficient causation, but I'm not so clear that that's right, so let me suggest a way in which it might not be. I was discussing this with Theo yesterday, I started to go back to neuroscience again, but there's a lot of interest at the moment about free energy neuroscience, in which what your brain's doing when you perceive something is on the basis of a primary set of sense data, constructing a theoretical model that best predicts that data. Your conscious experiences that theoretical model so construct. So it's kind of neo-Kantian in the sense that you bring a lot to the process yourself. It is ultimately efficiently caused by, let's say, the essence of the thing you're perceiving.
Yeah.
But you're not really passive in that either, because the process is kind of, you're constructing this model from two sides. It's constrained by the data, but it's underdetermined by the data.
Right.
So that seems to be an efficient causation model of how we might construct representations of the essences of things, but without ourselves being completely passive in that construction.
Right. Right. Okay. Good. Good. Yeah. So again, to clarify, I'm not denying that efficient causation is involved in the process of gaining understanding. I mean, I think it is. Right. It's by interacting with real horses in lots of ways that you gain knowledge of the essence of a horse, and that's an efficient causal interaction between us and horses. But what I'm focusing on here is just, once I understand the horse, right? Supposing I do, and that understanding then grounds knowledge I have about what's necessary for horses and so on, possible for them. Does that still involve some kind of efficient causal relationship between the horse essence and me? And I want to say that seems really implausible. I mean, I have to say the argument here is not super strong. I mean, it's just saying, look, here's a cost of the Platonic picture. It makes a human intellect into really a kind of system of Platonic forms and something else that are interacting in various ways, or at least or maybe not interacting, but the forms are impinging upon that intellect, at the moment of understanding, in the very act of understanding. And it seems to me we should prefer an account in which, when I understand something, that's purely intrinsic to me. But it's not a knockdown argument, certainly.
Daniel, as a follow-up.
Yeah. So I have a question about the knowledge we acquire through reading and books.
Yeah.
In what way are we acquiring the forms of things? Most of the knowledge that I think most of us have about physics or biology didn't come from doing experiments and didn't come from any experiences with the real things, but it's all entirely
not direct.
Not direct.
Yeah.
And so in what way are we getting the forms of blue whales or the forms of genetics by reading books?
Well, I guess I don't have a real detailed, interesting account here about transmission linguistically. We'll have to talk about that. But roughly, I'd say, well, those are instrumental causes, right? I mean, the primary cause are the forms of the essences of horses out there in the world, right? And they form duplicates of themselves in the human mind in various ways. To the investigator through the exercise of scientific investigation. And then the linguistic transmission of that information to me is some kind of instrumental cause by which ultimately the horse is still in the driver's seat here, so to speak, right? And that's merely a way of conveying that information into my mind.
Does that push you much closer to O'Callaghan's view then?
Well, I don't know that I actually disagree with O'Callaghan. I mean, it's just that, because in the end of the day, I think he says the right thing here, which is, yes, it's a causal connection, but of course, you have to take into account the nature of the receiver as well. And I think as long as you do that, and as long as you then interpret that in my sort of literal way, that there's a form that's conspecific with the horse in the mind, then that's fine. Because obviously not just any causal contact with horses is going to do this, right? or with horse scientists or whatever equinologists are, right? I mean, they could tell me about all kinds of things, or they could pull my leg and tell me all kinds of false stuff about horses, and that wouldn't work. It would have to be appropriate kinds of things that really are allowing the form of the horse itself to be directing the process, so to speak. But I think that's what language does do, actually.
Yeah.
Excellent. On the same point, then new question for John.
Just very quickly, connected to the issue of knowing things, knowing the form. I was thinking, of course, your theory looks very in line with externalism in a sense, because you have something out there, and your knowledge depends on the very concept of a horse, for example, depends on what are the properties of the horse and the essence of the horse. And this is, of course, a bit dangerous, because until you know the essence of the horse completely, you might even say you can't have knowledge of the horse in the relevant sense. I mean, if there is no complete knowledge, then you have no knowledge at all, because the essence could turn out to be different, and so what you had in mind was a horse. So I was thinking, is this, first of all, is this just like an externalistic view, and does it inherit the problems of externalism?
Yeah, okay, so on the very last point, I mean, you're right, and this is very much a work in progress in terms of accounting for how incomplete and imperfect knowledge is possible at all, right? Because you might look at the model and just say, it's all or nothing, and clearly we don't want that. And I tried to sort of sketch some possible ways around that. On the first point about externalism, yeah, so I think, well, we'd have to get into details here about it, but it seems to me that the Aristotelian picture, in a way, isn't easily classified as either internalist or externalist. There's some kind of common assumption there that the Aristotelian is denying, because it's certainly not the case that a perfect duplicate of me, right, could sort of fail to understand a horse if I do. Because if it's a perfect duplicate of me, and I've got the form of the horse in my mind, he's going to have the form of the horse in his mind too. And so, physical duplicate maybe, who knows, but in a complete duplicate in all respects, yeah, we're going to have exactly the same, content looks like it's going to supervene on the internal features. So it looks internalist in that sense.
Before you said you
the knowledge
understanding. Before you said you wouldn't have understanding, right? You made the example of duplicate, and you said
physical duplicate, right? I was imagining there could be a physical duplicate without understanding, and that would show the supervenience failed. But a perfect duplicate now, where not just physically, but also in terms of what forms are there, right? The content is going to be fixed internally. Also, I think your knowledge of the necessary truths is also going to be an internal matter, because you've got the form right there, right? Now, there's going to be knowledge about external contingent facts, where I'm going to be external. I'm going to be externalist, right? Whether I know that the market went up or down, it's not going to just supervene on me. Obviously, it's going to depend on the connections. Yeah.
Yeah. So just a question about the nature of forms, right? So there's this nice debate about whether forms are universal or individual, and there's arguments put forward that they must be individual because form has to be the principle being of actual substances, and you can't have a universal principle of being.
Right.
And that sort of seems to fit nicely with this sort of form, the idea of hymorphism that we've been discussing, that the forms are, as I think you said, like a causal principle in the sense of the individuals.
Yeah.
But then
that's the view I'm defending here anyway. Yeah.
Okay, but then the account of epistemology which you're giving seem to require that the forms are universals, right? So there you seem to be taking the sort of form in a universal sense, which is so this just
yeah.
Seems to be a tension. So I was wondering whether you wanted to comment.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the tension. You're right, and that's why in this diagram I'm trying to use this conspecificity relation to be the thing that solves that problem. So rather than having a universal out there, a single universal, right, which is somehow present in the mind or instantiated in the mind, you've just got these individual forms, and they stand in this very close sort of conspecificity relationship to each other, and that's enough, right? So how do I know necessary truths about that horse? Well, because both that horse and my active understanding have conspecific forms, right? There doesn't have to be a single universal, they don't think, to account for that. That's the thought.
So does that mean that it's not a single form?
There's not a single form of equinity, that's right. There's 17 billion, or however many horses there are, right? Forms of equinity, plus, if anybody understood horses, plus 2 or whatever, right? Yeah, so on the view that I'm, again, I mean, Anna and Bill both sort of pushing me on this, and maybe I don't need to reify forms at all, but on the picture I gave here in which I'm reifying the forms, they're individual, they're particular, not universal.